Good morning, Massimo. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. How about you?
Very good. Thanks. Very good. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join this series of Sentientist Conversations. As we've talked about briefly, it's, I guess, a series of conversations about the two deepest philosophical questions, what's real and what matters morally. And I have an obvious bias. It's in the name of the podcast because I'm trying to popularize and raise awareness of what you might call a philosophy of life that suggests we should, when thinking about what's real, we should use evidence and reason in a naturalistic approach. And when it comes to what matters, we should grant moral consideration for all sentient beings. So some people might see that as an upgrade or an extension of secular humanism, if you like, but others see it in a different way. Right. But I'm talking to people in these conversations who agree or disagree with that philosophy. So it'll be fascinating to see how your thinking fits in. But before we get on to those two deep questions, how would you best introduce yourself and your work for people that don't know of you already?
That's a good question. I always have trouble introducing myself. My background is in evolutionary biology. Initially, my first academic career was on the study of gene-environment interactions as biologists. And then at some point, sort of a midlife crisis took place, and I went back to school, got a degree in philosophy, and now I am a professor of philosophy of science at the City University of New York. That's the basic background.
That's great. Many of our listeners and watchers will know you from your work on both of those fields. So the first of the two deep questions I like to ask, and it seems somewhat embarrassing to ask this of a professional philosopher, but really is what's real. So for many of my guests, that's a story about how their philosophy has changed over their life, whether they grew up in supernatural, spiritual, religious, mystical sort of context, or one that was already more naturalistic and atheistic or skeptical, if you like, and how that side of their philosophy, both the methodology, but epistemology, about what's real and how to understand the universe has changed over time. And I know you've told many times, but it'd be interesting to know.
It's a similar story for me, actually. And I grew up Catholic because I grew up in Rome, Italy, where you're Catholic by default, usually. And therefore, for early on in my life, I kind of sort of accepted, although always with a little bit of qualms, the general Christian worldview. That is that the universe is created by a supernatural being who is all loving, all powerful, and all that sort of stuff. But I started questioning that pretty early on. And by the time I got to high school, I was just pretty much convinced that now that's not a reasonable way of looking at things. And ever since I have adopted the psycho-humanist perspective, which is the source of reliable or as reliable information and knowledge about the world that human beings can access is science, not religion or philosophy for that. Religion has its own social role, I guess, to play. Philosophy certainly has a number of roles to play in terms of general understanding of things and how we should do things. But when it comes down to how the universe actually works, the only source that I recognize as useful is as fallible and as provisional as it is science. So I adopted the secular-humanist perspective. However, eventually, that perspective itself turned out to be limited because while secular humanism tells me, that I should use reason and evidence to approach problems, which I try to do, and while I agree with some general tenets of secular humanism, such as universal human rights and concern for other people and so on and so forth, when it came to actual crisis, real crisis in my life, such as, for instance, my father dying a number of years ago, secular humanism was not very useful. I was like, okay, and so what do I do? It doesn't help me to think in terms of human rights when my father is dying. Yeah. And that is what brought me to, I think, what is a more practical philosophy of life, which is Stoicism. Stoicism is, of course, an ancient Greek-Roman philosophy, which shares a lot, especially in its modern incarnation, with secular humanism. For instance, the Stoics from the beginning were paying attention to evidence and reason. They were materialists. They thought that the universe is made of stuff. They thought that the universe is regulated by a cosmic web of cause and effect, which goes pretty well with the modern scientific outlook. But they were also very much concerned with the ethics, and they were very practical about the ethics. And by ethics, they meant not just the study of right and wrong, as it's mostly understood today, but really the study of how to live your life, how to live a meaningful life, which does include, the practice, which does include dealing with setbacks, such as your loved ones dying and things like that. So that's been my journey: Catholicism, secular humanism, Stoicism.
Yeah, thank you. The early part of that story that you went through, as you said, in the lead up to high school. What was it that really drove that turn away from Catholicism? Because the conversations I've had so far, there seem to be two themes. One, it's more about evidence and reason and fact-based, and I just don't see the evidence for these claims as credible. And maybe there are internal incoherences or inconsistencies within the stories I've been told, and they turn away really through logic and fact. Another one is rejecting some of the ethical values that sometimes flow through these religious worldviews, and there's a turning away from whether it's sexism or homophobia or the caste system or some other cruel punishments or some other part of the ethics that first makes people start to question a religious worldview. Was it one of the, or both, or a combination?
It was a combination, although early on, my concern was really mostly with the first one. That is, I just couldn't bear with some of the what I saw as inconsistencies or downright sort of puzzling claims. I remember questioning my priest about things like the Trinity. So the God is one or three or both? How does that work? Because that seems to contradict basic laws of logic. And or one of the big ones was the miracle of the notion of substantiation. So this notion, transubstantiation. So the notion that when you have communion as a Catholic, you're not metaphorically drinking the blood of Jesus and eating his flesh. You're literally doing so. Yeah. And I said, no, it doesn't taste, I don't know for sure, but it doesn't taste like human flesh and human blood. It tastes to me like a wafer and wine. So what the hell are you talking about? I'm prepared with accepting the notion that this is a metaphorical gesture that you do in order to reconnect to events that happened 2,000 years ago. But if you insist that an article of faith, of my faith, is that it should be, I should think of these things as little, then I'm sorry, it's not gonna happen. Yeah. That was also the time when I was in high school when I started studying philosophy, because not profession, of course, not in the sense of academic philosophy. That came much later on. But in high school, in Italy, you had to take 3 years of philosophy in high school. And so when I started reading people like David Hume or Bertrand Russell, okay, that's it. I'm done. There's no
I'm not going crazy here. These paths have been well trod, and
exactly. In terms of the ethics, I actually became more conscious later on of the more problematic aspects of Christian ethics, because it depends. So Christian ethics is a complex thing. And, if you look at the 10 Commandments, they sound pretty good, except for the ones that deal with, I should be your only God and a jealous God and stuff like that, which seem to me a little narcissistic and self-centered for coming from a God. But the rest, just don't kill, don't covet other, people's wives. And it's like, okay, that sounds pretty reasonable. And the teaching of Jesus, despite the occasional episode in the Gospels of Jesus losing his temper about something or another, which again is not something that I would expect from a God, it sounds like, he's telling us to be nice to people and be helpful and loving and all that. So it's not very objectionable. What is objectionable are, of course, some of the specific political positions that the Catholic Church has taken over the centuries, not just recently, right? The history of the Catholic Church is far more problematic than the actual basic, Christian doctrine. I don't think there is much wrong with basic Christian doctrine, but the fact that Christians have been politically involved in the extermination of people throughout centuries, and that have been pushing in modern times, obviously regressive policies, then that's problematic. But I don't know that I would lay the blame for that on Jesus, as opposed to patriarchal forces that have been at work inside and outside the Catholic Church for millennia.
Yeah, makes sense. And of course, there's often a strong focus on religion just because of its prevalence in the world and its social importance, but it's not the only school of thought that has supernatural or beliefs that aren't well founded in evidence and reason. And you've spoken out many times about the dangers of pseudoscience or anti-vaxxing, and the list goes on, unfounded conspiracy theories and so on. And it's interesting, both for those types of space and for religion, there's a challenge to them, which is saying they're just much less likely to be correct because they're not using evidence and reason. So to some degree, those beliefs feel like they're disconnected from reality or they're arbitrary. So again, there's a technical challenge to those things to say, look, they're just much more likely to be wrong. But there's also this open question about the degree to which those things, do they sometimes cause harm? Do they always cause harm? Is there some sort of insidious problem with believing based on evidence and reason? Or are there some unfounded beliefs that are harmless and trivial? And what do you think?
I don't believe that any unfounded belief is harmless. It can be ultimately. It could be harmless on the surface. For instance, if you read the horoscope in the morning over coffee, but then don't do anything about it. You just read it as I'm curious to see what Capricorn is about today. And then you don't actually act on that belief. That belief is in fact harmless in the immediate, right? However, you are indulging yourself in an attitude of, let me take more or less seriously things for which there is no particular reason or evidence to take them seriously. And that attitude, I think, crosses boundaries easily. So there is research that shows that once people start buying into mystical thinking or buying into conspiracy-oriented thinking and all that, then they jump easily from one type of mysticism to another, from one type of pseudoscience to another, from one type of conspiracy to another. So there's always a danger, I think, in letting yourself accepting or at least entertaining seriously notions for which there is no reason or evidence. On this, I'm squarely with David Hume, who said that a reasonable person proportions his beliefs to the evidence. It's interesting that he puts it that way, right? Proportion beliefs, because belief is actually, we tend to think of belief as all or nothing. And by the way, I'm drawing a distinction between belief and faith. Faith, in my way of understanding things, is believing without evidence or even against the evidence.
Yeah.
Like my priest who said that I'm literally drinking the blood of Christ. That's against the evidence, but he believes it. So that's faith. But most beliefs are not faith. Most beliefs are aligned along a spectrum, a continuum that goes from 0 to 100%. So I may have, for instance, what's my belief that climate change is actually happening right now. Right at the moment, that belief is 99% or higher. But if you had asked me the question 30 years ago, I might have been said maybe 60, 70%, depending on what it is. So in other words, I try to proportion the belief to the evidence. At this point, there is so much overwhelming evidence in favor of the notion of climate change that it seems to me very unreasonable to reject the notion. But 30 years ago or 50 years ago, there was far less evidence. There was much more debate, reasonable debate. So skepticism about climate change might have been reasonable 3 decades ago, but it's not reasonable today. Beliefs change and they change gradually. The only thing you want to do with belief, you don't want to do with beliefs, is to go to the extreme, either 0 or 100%.
Yeah.
Because if you are either 0 or 100% certain about something, then you essentially now change corner yourself. Your belief has become faith.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So my
You've
priest
almost
was
disengaged
100%.
your critical faculties by definition, right? No new evidence will shift you.
No evidence was shifted. And some of your listeners might have recognized this, what I just described, as basically the Bayesian approach to probability estimates. Theory is a major component of probability theory, which tells you that it actually is based on an equation, Bayes equation, that actually tells you how to feed information into your existing belief system so that you can keep updating your belief about a particular thing as a result of the evidence. But what Bayesians tell you is never get your priors, which is what they call your current state of belief, to either 0 or 100, because they can show you mathematically that if it is 0 or 100, then it's not movable. You cannot move it. New evidence is not going to change it. It's not going to shift it. That's why I stay away from, in the case of, let's say, religion, from both extremes. Either the person who tells me that he's absolutely certain that there is a God, or the person who tells me that there is absolutely certain that there is no God. My priors, there are 99.999999999 that there is no God, but that point leaves it open that I could be wrong.
Yeah. I think that's the critical thing. You've got to be open-minded, even about potentially crazy ideas. But that doesn't mean you grant credence to them without the evidence. And it doesn't mean you necessarily invest a lot of time and effort into looking for evidence for those things, because there's a functionally infinite number of things for which there is no evidence that we could choose to believe in. So.
That's exactly right. Carl Sagan famously said that it's nice to have an open mind, but you don't want to have it so open that your brain falls off, right? And more importantly, what you're saying is there is an almost essentially infinite number of notions that you might entertain. And often when I talk to people, including some of my own relatives, about pseudoscience or about bizarre notions, often I notice that they ask the wrong question. They tend to ask a question, well, but isn't it possible that?
Yeah.
And this notion is going to be true. And the answer usually is, Yeah, unless it's a logical impossibility or a mathematical impossibility, it's possible. But that's the wrong question to ask. The question is, how likely is it that notion is true? Is it possible, for instance, that there has been a conspiracy of Illuminati over the last 2,000 years that has controlled world's events? Sure, I cannot prove that it isn't. It's no laws of logic is violated by that notion. But do I entertain the notion seriously? Not chance, because I see no evidence and no reason to do it. So all sorts of things are possible, although not everything is possible. As I said, there are things that are logically impossible. But all sorts of things are possible, but that's irrelevant. That's not a good guide to your life, because there's too many of them. Then you're bound to entertain an infinite number of possibilities. And what are you going to do? How much time do you have to entertain all those possibilities?
Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't need 100% confidence in our beliefs to be able to act in the world. By definition, we don't. I'm completely with you. I love that Bayesian approach. I'd like to describe it as holding beliefs probabilistically and provisionally, and where they have an ethical impact with some prudence maybe as well. And I think that way of thinking can also help counter the tone that sometimes comes through from rationalists, skeptics, atheists, scientists, who can actually sound quite dogmatic and overconfident, because maybe they've just in their communication forgotten that need for humility and open-mindedness. It doesn't mean you can't have confidence in your evidence, but
yes, I know. I have a lot of names that come to mind in that group. And that's one of the problems. I do consider myself a scientific skeptic. I go to skeptic conferences. I write for skeptical magazines and things like that. But I am in a fairly uncomfortable company sometimes of people that seem to be just as narrow-minded and as close-minded as the very people that they criticize. They rightly criticize. I mean, the criticism is still good, but it's as you said, there is a difference in terms of attitude.
Yeah, and I think that's a shame in a sense, because it makes them sometimes blind to issues in their own ways of thinking. And we'll come on to one of my favorites later on. But it's also not a good example to set. And it's also not a very effective way of communicating either, because it just tends to put people's backs up.
Very few people will respond positively to somebody who is arrogantly tell you that you're an idiot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a rare thing.
You're not going to change your mind.
And I also share your view that you laid out earlier on about the danger of poorly founded beliefs and that way of accepting belief without evidence sort of leaking across boundaries and domains and infecting them. And that leads me to actually I think I'm very open-minded in terms of freedom of religion and freedom of belief, and I'm very comfortable people believing in what they like. But it does lead me to quite a challenging tone around religion, because I think even if you took a religion that almost completely modernized its ethics, it stripped out the sexism, stripped out the homophobia, there's no caste discrimination, there's no cruel punishments, you don't threaten children with hell, you take all of that stuff out, so you make their practices and their ethics, if you like, almost completely in line with a modern secular humanistic or sentientistic way of thinking. I think that's a massive step forward, and many religions are haltingly moving along that journey already. But there's still a problem left. A child is still going into one classroom in a religious school and being told, in this class, it's okay to believe without evidence. And then they're expected to go into a biology class or a physics class or a life matters class and be told skepticism and evidence and rationality. So I am very nervous that even if you take out all of the direct negative impacts of a supernatural worldview, it's very hard to avoid some harm leaking in somewhere or other, just because it's basically you're understanding the world wrong and it gives you an excuse, it gives some validity to believing arbitrarily. So that does make me nervous generally.
Yes, I agree. I share that sentiment. And the thing is, at some point or another, those two attitudes of outside of this place, look at the evidence and make up your mind, and inside this place, believe what an alleged God told you, because that's it. That's the end of the story. It will come into conflict, because what happens if something that your priest or your preacher or your rabbi or whatever it is says God wants conflicts with the evidence? At that point, you have to make a decision, right? And that decision will show your true colors. If you're going to say, I'm sorry, rabbi or priest, but no, I can't believe that, then you're really not religious.
Yeah.
If you're willing to reject the authority of God, then you might call yourself religious. You might think that you are, but in fact, when it push comes to shove, you're not. You're just not acting accordingly. Or more dangerously, you will act against reason and evidence, in which case you truly are a religious person. But at that point, you are showing the danger of being religious. Yeah. That your religion will. So one of the differences between religions and philosophies such as secular humanism or Stoicism, for instance, is that if I think of myself as a secular humanist and I find something that, let's say, Carl Sagan wrote or Paul Kurtz wrote and I disagree with, I can say so publicly, not a problem, because they're not Jesus. You're not God. If I practice Stoicism and it turns out that Seneca said something that doesn't make any sense anymore 2,000 years later, I can say, hey, you know what? Seneca was wrong about that. I cannot say that as a religious person about Jesus, God, or whoever it is that you're worshiping, because that's impious. That's just, you can't do that. You can't say, oh yeah, I'm a Christian. Jesus needs to be updated. No, it doesn't work that way. And that is the problem, I think. In the end, you are forced, if you really are truly seriously religious, you are forced, as a friend of mine used to say, to check your brain at the entrance of the church.
Yeah, because the answers are already laid out. And we've touched already on this link between these two deep questions of what's real and what matters, because we've danced around some of the sort of ethical and moral implications of these worldviews as well. So that would be another interesting story to hear from you, because one of the things a religious or a supernatural person might say to you or I, who has a naturalistic worldview, is, okay, if there is no deity to judge you, there is no list of commandments, there is no Quran laying out the rules, surely you've lost any grounding for your morality at all.
Right.
How do you answer that challenge? And again, how have you gone through that journey as you moved away from Catholicism? Did you feel like there was a gaping void that needed to be filled, that you need to rebuild, or was it a different process?
Yeah, I call that the Tolstoy fallacy, because Tolstoy at some point near the end of his life went through a crisis like that and basically concluded that unless there is a God, then the whole thing is meaningless and you might as well go around murdering and raping people. No, there are obviously secular roots to morality, but not only secular, just even natural roots to morality. I believe in something called, sometimes referred to as naturalistic ethics. And pretty much every kind of virtue ethics, Aristotle, the Stoics, the Epicureans, whatever, or in the Eastern traditions, Confucianism, are all kind of naturalistic ethics. And arguably the best modern author that has written about this is the British philosopher Philippa Foot, who wrote a book called Natural Goodness. And the basic idea, which is in fact confirmed by science, is that human beings are naturally pro-social. We're naturally cooperative because natural selection designed us that way. So we tend to have we develop instinctive, strong bonds with the people that surround us, with our caretakers, with our friends, with our siblings, and so on and so on. And then eventually we broaden those bonds to pretty much everybody who is part of our local group, so to speak. That is natural. You don't need to make any effort for it. Yes, there are exceptions. There are psychopaths everywhere, but those are actually literally defective, biologically defective human beings. These are beings that are in a social sense because they don't feel the kind of basic empathy toward others that is ingrained in us. David Hume was wrong about a number of things, but he got it right when he said that reason is and ought to be the slave of passions, right? So reason is the slave of passions to some extent. I'm not sure that it ought to be. That in fact, I would argue that's not a good idea.
Yeah.
But it's not, and in fact, it's not really the slave of passions. It originates from the passions, meaning that we have an instinct, as Hume understood, in fact, for cooperative social behavior. Now, the problem is that if you stick with just evolution, that doesn't get you very far, because this pro-social instinct that we have applies to our in-group, but not to any outside group, because, of course, evolutionarily speaking, anybody from the outside was probably going to be trouble. And therefore, on the one hand, it is true that we're naturally pro-social, but we're also naturally xenophobic.
Yeah, it works both ways.
Yes, it works both ways. So that's something that the Stoics understood and David Hume understood, even though neither one of them knew anything about evolution. And that is why both of them said that nature provides us with the beginning of virtue, meaning the beginning of pro-social behavior, but then it's reason that expands it. So it is when you start thinking about stuff, they say, wait a minute, I am cooperative and pro-social. I care about these people because I know them, but it's these people only by accident of birth. It could have been anybody else on the planet because I could have been born in any other place or time.
Yeah.
Therefore, it's reason that kind of allows you to extrapolate your natural goodness, as Foot put it, and make it become a universal goodness. And the Stoics initially stopped at humanity at large. That is, they didn't include non-human sentient beings. I think modern Stoics, just like modern psycho-humanists, tend to go beyond humanity, because I think the right answer, the right attitude was proposed by Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, when he said that when it comes to other animals, the question is not whether they think or whether they talk. The question is whether they feel and whether they can suffer. If if an entity can't suffer, then it is wrong to make it suffer. So that to me, that's the end of the story. But that conclusion is the result of these two forces, of a natural instinct for being good and cooperative, and your reason that tells you that you should extend that instinct and apply it to situations to where it doesn't go by itself. If we were not social animals, we wouldn't be talking about ethics. Right? If we were entirely solitary species that met with other members of our species only for reproduction purposes, there would be no ethics. Ethics is a human invention.
Yeah. But
it's a human invention that comes out of a natural propensity to behave cooperatively to other people.
Yeah. And I think that process also takes you from a sort of description of whereas ethics come from. And you might even argue it even has pre-human roots in that we weren't the first social beings that had kin selection and reciprocity and tribal dynamics, and essentially felt the evolutionary benefit of being able to cooperate. And I guess ethics flows from that. But it takes you from that descriptive understanding of where our ethics has come from into something that can feel more prescriptive because it's based on reasoning and rationality, and where we...
Yes, it's prescriptive. However, I wouldn't go to Kant. Kant is famously put in terms of a categorical imperative, which is his own version of the commandments, right? There's one commandment for Kant, categorical imperative. However, the problem with Kant is that he thought that reason by itself, with no aid, would allow you to discover the laws of morality. In other words, he thought that the laws of morality are universal. They are there, regardless of whether they are human beings or not, or regardless of whether there are sentient beings or not. The laws
sort
of
moral realism, like a Platonic ideal floating.
Exactly. Very strong moral realism, similar to realism in science. You know, when a scientist would rightly say gravity is going to work regardless of whether you believe it or not. It doesn't matter. I think Kant was wrong in that. As I said, there's no ethics is not real in that sense. It's real in the sense of being a mix of natural tendencies of the human animal and social construction that is the result of thinking about stuff. So it's real in that sense, but it's not universally real in the way in which Kant thought. That is why Philippa Foot talks not about categorical imperatives, but conditional imperatives. That is, ethics works as a set of conditional imperatives that are usually, you can lay them down, you can visualize them as a number of if-then. Right? So if you want to be a thriving member of a human society and you want to be able to pursue your projects, etc., then you need to be nice to other people. You need not to steal. You need not to kill, et cetera, et cetera. And that way of approaching things explains, therefore, what happens when people don't. When the psychopath says, I don't care. I'm okay killing people, or I'm okay taking advantage of people or something like that. Well, he's not adopting the conditional imperative. If there were a categorical imperative, it would be hard to imagine how is it possible that people can violate it. You can't, as I said, you cannot violate the laws of physics, but you can easily violate the laws of ethics. Unfortunately, we see that all the time. So I think it helps thinking of ethics as a set of hypothetical imperatives that are the result of our thinking built on the basis of our natural instincts, pro-social instincts.
Yeah. And I think I share that way of thinking because it avoids the strong moral realism that thinks there are moral truths floating out there. From my perspective, before sentient beings existed, there was no such thing, right? There was no harm to be done. There was no suffering to be experienced. There was no flourishing. There was no wrong or right. So in that sense, it is absolutely a construct, a conditional construct based on the existence of sentient beings that can have experiences, to my mind.
Right.
But at the same time,
sorry, go ahead.
But at the same time, it avoids the sort of saying, okay, if there isn't, real moral truths, let's abandon that completely and go to a sort of uber nihilistic or relativistic approach that says our choices are therefore arbitrary. There is I think, a very strong middle ground based on that conditional view, which is in simple terms, I don't like suffering. I'm pretty sure you don't either. If I care about that, that is really morality. You can always choose not to care about the experiences of others, but then you're just choosing to be immoral, I think. So.
And you're choosing, given the fact that most other people, at least to some extent, choose to stay within a society and act accordingly. If you're choosing not to, then you're basically self-ostracizing. You're now being seen as the jerk. You're now being seen as the sociopath or whatever it is.
Hopefully the rest of us will punish you or constrain you.
And the rest of us will punish you. And in fact, this is something that we know exists also outside of the human animal. So I think I'm pretty convinced that human beings are the only ones for which the category of ethics applies, meaning a conscious ethics. That I don't think that there are other animals. I could be wrong, but I don't think that there are other animals that just spend time doing what we're doing, talking about ethics and philosophy and saying, would it be right or would it be wrong to do these kind of things? Other animals don't seem to be doing that. Again, I could be wrong because we're not in other animals' minds, but I don't think they do. That doesn't mean that they don't have the instinctual component, however. So a lot of other social primates have these very strong instinctual components that essentially brings them to behave in a way that when we look at it from the outside, we would say it's ethical. For instance, some other social primates, when they see one of the members of their own group doing something that is unfair, like hoarding food for himself, for instance, away from the group, they punish him.
Yeah.
They go there and beat him up. And they don't beat him up just in order to take the food. It's the way they do it, it's clearly punishment. In other words, it's meant to be as a deterrent for future such opportunities. So we do see the rudiments of ethical behavior, what we would call ethical behavior, in other animals as well. Research done by primatologists like Frans de Waal bears this pretty clearly. Now,
I was lucky enough to interview him a few episodes ago. Yeah.
Exactly. Now, do I therefore think that, let's say, bonobos actually engage in ethics in the sense of philosophizing about what they're doing? No, I have no evidence that they do that. I don't think so. They are stuck, evolutionarily speaking, with the instinctual part, right? We share that instinctual part, and on top of that, we are capable of actually reasoning about it, and therefore it's incumbent on us to make sure that we do the right thing according to our best understanding of the right thing.
Yeah, makes sense. And you touched on a topic which I think is of absolutely central importance in moral philosophy, but to my mind is too often neglected, which is that one of moral scope and which entities warrant moral consideration. And part of the reason I've ended up talking about this idea of sentientism, which is a term that came out of the animal advocacy and animal ethics literature in the 1970s through people like Richard Ryder and Peter Singer and others. Part of the reason I've latched onto that term came from my personal frustration with secular humanism. So my personal path was, again, gently Christian upbringing, right, thought things through ethically, and from a fact base came to atheism. Atheism says very, very little, if anything, about morality whatsoever. Found humanism and liked the expansive, as you said, universal human rights, compassion for all humans. But increasingly, I came to see there being a problem in the way humanism was framed, in that it's very clearly focused on humans and that species.
Right.
And while
right in the name.
It's right in the name. And while in recent years, Humanist UK and the International Humanists Association and so on have started adding in a couple of bullet points here and there, say we also have a concern for other sentient beings and sentient animals, it's not gone anywhere near far enough, because it seems that what that's really doing is just reflecting the average human mindset, which hopefully they conceptually care about all human beings, at least in concept, right? Although we have plenty of work still to do on that front. That job isn't done yet either. But their concern for other sentient beings is at best very patchy. We might think about charismatic wild animals that we'll enjoy watching on nature programs. We might enjoy the experiences of being with our companion animals. We viscerally, intuitively, and scientifically know that they can suffer, and we care about that as well. But that's pretty much where it stopped. Part of my frustration is that it feels like most of the world of moral philosophy and most humanist thinkers and leaders and most rationalists and skeptics and free thinkers, and you're an exception to this, but most of them seem to operate on a basis that basically humans are pretty much the only entities that really matter. And then they've gone on to develop different philosophies of life and different ethical systems. But when you read the papers and you work through their thinking, humans are always the raw material of our moral consideration, and that's pretty much it. So that's partly why you can think about this spectrum of anthropocentrism, maybe sentiocentrism, thinking about all beings that have the capacity to experience. You can go even further to biocentrism and ecocentrism. For me, it felt really important to have a very clear statement about that sentiocentric, all sentient beings warrant serious moral consideration, and to carry that through into practice as well, which is another problem.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, the practice, of course, is always important. It is important. Otherwise, the theory by itself doesn't. It's pretty sterile. Yeah. So my thinking about that is there is one thing that psychohumanists do get right, and that is that even when we are concerned about other sentient beings, as we should be, as I said, I certainly agree. As I said, if they have a capability of suffering, then we should be concerned. And I'll come back to that in a minute to talk a little bit, maybe address your additional point about should we expand it even further to the environment at large or something like that? Because I actually think that the answer there is no.
Me too.
Or at least there is no rational basis for doing so. But anyway, so it is certainly true that we should expand our concern, our ethical concern, toward other sentient beings. However, it is equally true, as I think a psychohumanist would say, that we are the only one capable of doing so. Yeah. That is, ethics is still a human construction. As I said, chimpanzees don't go around talking about ethics. Lions certainly don't go around talking about ethics. Ants don't talk about ethics. They're just not concerned. So it would be ridiculous, for instance, to say these days there is a lot of legal attempts to give personhood to non-human animals, such as elephants and chimpanzees and things like that. And I see that those attempts are well-intentioned because the notion is you want to protect those species from human abuse, essentially. But I think they're philosophically fundamentally flawed, because to be a person means that you have certain rights, but you also have certain duties. Rights come with duties in the human world. And those animals, because of the kinds of entities that they are, they can only have rights. You cannot expect you're not going to put a chimpanzee in prison because it does something unethical. It's just not going to happen, because that chimpanzee is not responsible for what it does other than to its instincts. It doesn't think through, again, at least as far as we can tell. And therefore, you wouldn't be able to bring him up for charges of murder, for instance, or stealing or anything like that. It would be ridiculous to do. But if it is ridiculous to do so, then I think it's equally ridiculous to consider that individual a person with rights come with responsibilities. They are connected. They're deeply interconnected. That doesn't mean that we should therefore be able to abuse chimpanzees or elephants as we like. But it does mean that the locus of ethical decision-making still does rest with humans, and humans only, as far as we're concerned, save for the possibility, of course, of extraterrestrials who have also developed some kind of ethics. So I make a distinction, in other words, who is in charge of who is making ethical decisions? As far as I can tell, it's only humans. And who should be the object of ethical decisions. And as far as I can tell, that should include any sentient organism, and I define sentience as capable of suffering.
Yeah.
Capable of experiencing the equivalent of pain.
That makes sense. And I think it's certainly true that, we should have responsibilities that go along with our capabilities. And there aren't any other species that are going to come along and work to mitigate suffering or solve climate change or resolve other issues as well. So while we're responsible for many awful things, there isn't any other species who's going to be able to fix stuff either. So, but this might be a slight tangent, but I do think that it's quite hard to draw a really clear distinction there. And there's an interesting thought experiment I've done recently, which looks actually at humans as well, and says if you take a deterministic approach to thinking about the way reality is, that could, in some concepts, render the concepts of free will and moral agency somewhat irrelevant, right? In a way, aren't we just more richly complex, cognitively capable versions of animals? Is there really a distinction between the instinct and the rationality? And that might be a little bit of a dead end to go down, but in a way, it might open up a different way of thinking about human justice that strips out retribution and blame, recognizes the deep importance of moral luck, and still allows you to retain rehabilitation, deterrence, protection of others, and all of the sort of more positive aspects of a justice system.
No, that's right. That's one of the
apply
reasons.
that in a way to humans. And arguably, without getting too sci-fi, you could imagine that being applied even to non-humans as well, in the sense that, you know, if there is a wild animal that threatens others, we would be justified in constraining it. Whether you hold it responsible or not, whether you think it's a moral agent or not, arguably isn't so relevant.
That's right. That's one of the reasons I like Stoicism, is precisely because they do take that attitude. The Stoics were, in terms of free will, they were what we would today call compatibilists. That is, they thought that on the one hand, that the universe is cause and effect, and human beings are no exception to the web of cause and effect. However, some modern critics of compatibilism or free will, like Sam Harris, think that basically we are puppets whose strings are moved by the universe. That just doesn't stand up to scrutiny, because we are part and parcel of the web of cause and effect. It's not that things happen to us from the outside. We are members of, we're a component of that. So the Stoics accordingly distinguished between internal causes and external causes, right? So your will, your prohairesis, as they called it in Greek, is part of the web of cause and effect, and therefore it is affected by external circumstances, and it in turn affects external circumstances. And you are responsible, quote unquote, for what you do, insofar as your decisions are internally generated by your little local bit of the web of cause and effect. But the upshot was that, in fact, the Stoics do think that talking about blame is useless. There's a famous quote by Marcus Aurelius where he says, "Don't blame the person that makes progress, doesn't blame others, and in fact doesn't even blame himself. It's just the world is what it is, and people do what they do. And your focus should not be on blaming either other people or yourself. It should be to, what part of my own internal mechanisms can I improve so that I make better decisions and I'm more helpful to the human cosmopolis." That's it. That should be. So it's a constructive approach toward things. It's not a matter of blaming or a matter of punishing things. Epictetus, another very prominent Stoic philosopher, says, when you see somebody who does wrong, think of him as a blind person. He just doesn't see that what he's doing is wrong. He thinks it's right. Even people who do wrong, think the obvious extreme example, Hitler. I'm pretty sure that Hitler didn't get up in the morning, go to the mirror, and like a Disney cartoon, villain, started laughing and say, "What can I do? What evil can I do today?" No, he was convinced that what he was doing was right, was to help the German people who have been abused and neglected after World War I, that sort of stuff. I'm sure he was convinced that what he now was he? No, it was awfully wrong, and what he did was horrible. But nevertheless, as actually the Dalai Lama once explained, if we could go back in time and kill Hitler, we should definitely kill Hitler, and we should in fact kill him with some fanfare, because it's an important thing we're doing, but not with anger. And the reason you shouldn't be angry at Hitler is because Hitler was a bit of the karmic, as what the Buddhists describe as the karmic web, or the Stoics would say the web of cause and effect. Yeah. He didn't ask to be there.
The universe, right. Yeah.
Exactly. It's a product of the universe. He didn't ask to be there, and he acted his role according to the local circumstances. So should we eliminate him if possible? Absolutely. Should we do that with anger and resentment? No, because it's useless. What does that add to things? Yeah. So compassion rather than hatred should be the attitude.
And I think that's another really important point that I try and push in this sentientism idea is it is genuinely universal compassion. That doesn't mean weakness. It doesn't mean appeasement. It doesn't mean you allow harm, but it does mean compassion for ourselves, compassion for other humans, compassion even for humans we disagree with on Twitter, and compassion for all sentient beings. We start with that.
Isn't it amazing
unashamed universal
people, isn't it amazing how many people mistake compassion for appeasement and and a compassion attitude for quietism? It's like I often have a hard time wrapping my mind around this. The Stoics are often accused of, so you just lay down and don't do anything while the Holocaust goes on. No, who told you anything like like that. I just said, if possible, Hitler should be killed, just not with rage. Not with
the distinction.
It should be killed in the same way, with the same attitude in which a doctor excites a tumor. You don't get upset at the tumor. You don't get angry at the tumor. You don't blame the tumor. You just take it out if you can.
Yeah. And I wanted to come back to the central idea of moral scope, because I think you and I agree. We go back to Bentham. We think about suffering as being the boundary. One challenge to that is many people do, at least in practice, push back and say, look, it is only humans that matter. Others go beyond, and you mentioned already, biocentrism and ecocentrism. And I'd love to go into your response to those, but I don't think we've quite got time to do that now, because you've written on no, nature doesn't have rights and she's not a person, which I thought was a great piece. And also talking about the common challenge of, whether plants think too and whether they're sentient. So I remain open-minded about the boundaries of sentience, and I'll always look to the scientific evidence. So sentientism doesn't tell you which things are sentient, it just says follow the science. So fine, if evidence is unearthed that plants are sentient, I'll go along with it. But so far there has been absolutely none, and I see very little chance of any emerging. But I think you and I probably share a view about the biocentrism and ecocentrism, that we can care about things that aren't sentient in a deep way instrumentally because they're so important to the sentient beings, but they don't intrinsically have interests or needs or wishes, and they can't suffer. So extending moral consideration more broadly seems to have gone too far.
Exactly. I agree. Planets don't suffer, and therefore they are not the proper object of ethical considerations. Now, as you say, there are other considerations, however. There are instrumental considerations. The reason we shouldn't mess around with our own planet too much is because it's our house. It's our home, right? So if you keep wreaking havoc in your home, you're not going to have a good life. You're not going to live in the garbage. You're going to be poisoning yourself and stuff like that. So you probably shouldn't do it. Instrumentally, if you want to have a good, again, this is another one of those conditional imperatives. If you want to have a good life, then you probably shouldn't crap all over your own house, because that's not going to make it for a good life. There are also other considerations, for instance, that again, however, arise from the nature of humanity. For instance, aesthetic considerations. I just went with my wife for a vacation in visiting some of the national parks of the Southwest, the American Southwest. And they're beautiful from a human perspective. Beauty is not in nature. Beauty is another, to me, it's like ethics. It's a human construct. It's not like there are things that are intrinsically beautiful. I didn't even know what that means. I don't know how to cash that out in terms that are actually logically coherent. But they're certainly beautiful to me. And
that's going on in here,
Right, it's going on in here. And apparently, however, it's not just me. I'm not the only one who finds the Grand Canyon beautiful. Judging from the number of visitors that went there, it's a lot of people that judge the Grand Canyon to be beautiful. Now, we can have interesting discussions which should be empirically based and science informed about where exactly a sense of aesthetic comes from in human beings. I would suggest that just like ethics, aesthetic comes out of a combination of instinct built in by natural selection and then reasoning and culture, right? So there are certain things, for instance, certain characteristics that almost universally human beings find beautiful, like symmetry is typically beautiful. If we see a symmetric object of any kind, we find it beautiful. That's probably, this is speculation, but it's probably ingrained in us by natural selection, because symmetry in other human beings is indicative of health. If you're a fairly symmetrical looking human being, you're healthy. If you're non-symmetrical, if you start having, developmental abnormalities, you're not healthy. And therefore, biologically speaking, you're problematic. I shouldn't want to have kids with you. And therefore, I'm not going to find you beautiful. That, I think, is the beginning of aesthetics. But of course, aesthetics in contemporary societies is the result of incredibly complex cultural evolution, processes of cultural evolution and societal construction and so on and so forth. Why do I find, for instance, Picasso's paintings beautiful? They're definitely not symmetrical. There's no symmetry. In fact, that's the whole point. He breaks symmetry all the time. But he breaks symmetries in ways that a lot of us think interesting, and therefore we're kind of captivated. In fact, I wouldn't really say that Picasso's paintings are beautiful. I would say they are interesting, they are appealing, but not necessarily beautiful, and so on and so forth. So there can be, as far as the environment is concerned, there can be pragmatic considerations. It's our house, it's our home, so we better treat it accordingly. There can be aesthetic considerations. But I don't see how one could say, oh, you need to be respecting the environment because it's intrinsically ethically valuable. That doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't. why?
I'm with you. Now, the final question I like to come on to is, given everything we've talked about, seeing as we've sorted out what's real and we've sorted out what matters and we've put those to bed now, I'm sure everyone will agree with us, is how to think about the future in that context. You and I think, we share a naturalistic worldview. We share a sentiocentric worldview that has compassion for all sentient beings. I think we might differ on whether we go down a Stoic or a virtue ethics or a consequentialist or some other path after that. But the baseline, those two sort of platforms seem pretty consistent. And I think we share a good degree of confidence that they're well-founded. But most people on the planet disagree with this, either because they do have supernatural, some revealed worldview, at least in certain domains of their thinking.
Right.
Though day to day, most people are still fairly naturalistic when they work out what to do minute to minute. But
I don't know many people who pray in the morning instead of turning the ignition key in their car.
Exactly.
Yeah, they don't expect miracles.
So there's a distinction there. And in a way, many more people, I think, agree with us in concept, or maybe in practice, than they do in concept on the naturalism stuff. On the sentiocentric stuff, I think it's actually the other way around, because I think most people on the planet would say needlessly causing a non-human animal to suffer is a moral negative, but nearly everybody on the planet does it and is indoctrinated into seeing practically the needless suffering and killing of non-human sentient beings as just something that's normal, natural, necessary, and almost an expected part of most societies. In that situation, I think it's almost the other way around, where people agree with sentiocentrism and Bentham and you and me in concept, but in practice, the day-to-day decisions are a world away because of that deep cultural indoctrination and the moral norms around, for example, animal farming and the way we exploit them. So in that, and I know that's a sort of journey you're working through personally as well. In a way, I like to, sometimes there seems to be similarities between the journey away from a religion and the journey away from the practices of consuming animal products, because the starting point is so deeply resonant, so rich in its social connections,
right,
that even though the logic seems very clear and the ethics seem very clear, it's still remarkably hard to extract ourselves from each of those things and get to a more compassionate place. But how does that leave you thinking about the future? Because it seems like technically coming to the right answers doesn't seem necessarily that hard, but the challenge is certainly one of deeply ingrained social norms and cultures and patterns of behavior. I know I'm running over time a little bit, but another crazily broad question about how does that leave you thinking about the future and making the world better for all sentient beings?
I am not optimistic about the future in the short or even medium term. I tend to be optimistic about the very, very long term. So let me explain what I mean. I think that humanity has made moral progress. Again, bracketing what we were saying earlier on, that morality is not a universal thing. It is a human construction. Yeah. But nevertheless, we've been making moral progress, meaning that we have expanded the range of our moral considerations. So if you think about it, until recently, like a little bit more than a century ago, it was acceptable in many human societies to enslave people.
Yeah.
Today, it's not. Now, there are still enslaved
in most places,
people.
Yeah.
Right, in the world. The majority of human beings, today would say, no, that's not acceptable. Until literally years ago, it was unthinkable for most Americans to acknowledge that gay and transgender people should be able to marry. And now the majority of Americans agrees that is, in fact, of course, they should be able to do it. Now, why would they want to do it? It's their business, but they should be able to do it. So there are instances of moral progress, which of course can be reversed. Moral progress it's not a linear thing that once you achieve a goal, then that's it. You're done with it. There's always the danger of sliding back.
I've just been watching The Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah, exactly. But in the long run, I think we have made progress. The reason I'm not very optimistic in the short and medium range is because, as you said a minute ago, there's always people, and there's always been people who have seen very clearly what needed to be done, and they were regularly ignored, if not put to death. I'm just finishing now writing a book about Socrates and his friend Alcibiades, who was a really interesting character and who eventually became an Athenian statesman and general and made all sorts of mess out of his life, despite being Socrates' student. And so presumably learning something from Socrates. And one of the things that I had to do for that, writing that book, was to reread Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, which was this disastrous enterprise that not only ended up with the defeat of Athens, from which the Athenians never recovered, but in fact, in a sense, was the defeat of the entire Greece, because it weakened so much even the winners, Sparta, that then just a generation later, Philip of Macedon came down and just conquered the whole damn thing. So it was a completely self-defeating enterprise. It was entirely irrational. It was conducted in a way that was clear to some people, including Thucydides. If you read the history, Thucydides makes very clear and very incisive comments about, like, why are these people doing this thing? Don't they see that this is obviously not the right thing to do? This is obviously going to lead to a catastrophe, and yet the majority of people went ahead and did the catastrophe. That's what makes me not particularly optimistic. For instance, apply the same issue to climate change. Right? We've seen climate change coming now for decades. Some people have seen it very early on. Now a large number of people do see it. It's happening, and we're still not doing anything. Yeah, we're doing pretty much close to nothing about it for a number of reasons: short-term interests, financial interests, the political interests, weakness of the will, whatever it is, a number of reasons. So what I think is going to happen is that, despite the fact that we saw it coming, despite the fact that there have been very clear hints on how to deal with it, and people have had very good ideas about how to preempt this problem.
We know the answers.
Right. What's gonna happen is collapse will happen. We will go through the catastrophe, and then we'll recover. Because human beings are very good at foreseeing a catastrophe, not caring enough until the catastrophe actually happens, and then recover from it. So in other words, unfortunately, there will be a lot of unnecessary suffering. Yeah. That for decades, possibly even centuries. Will it be a extinction level event? No, I don't think so. I don't think there is any reason to think that human beings are not going to make it on the other side of this thing. Is it going to be a civilization collapsing event? I don't think so either. Is it going to be really painful for a lot of people, especially the people that are the more poor and the less advantaged? Yes, absolutely. Is that suffering avoidable? Yes, absolutely. Are we going to avoid it? No.
Yeah. So I think you're right. It just seems that we're pretty impressive at turning things around quickly when we're in the heart of the crisis and when it's slapping us around the face. But up to that point, we're just like the toddler who can't resist reaching its hand into the fire and actually has to feel the pain before we pull our hand back out. It's right. Yep. Whether we'll get better over time, as we've done this so many times, who knows? But one thing I think is, an encouraging part of the story is that as we've extended our moral circle and moral scope of consideration, it's actually helped the people doing the extension as well. And I think climate change is another example of that. If we can break this taboo about challenging not just fossil fuels and not just all of the other problems that people like to talk about, but challenge the centrality of animal agriculture and what that does to the climate, let alone what it does to other sentient beings. Again, there are win-win opportunities here. Not everything is a zero-sum trade-off.
No, and that's the maddening thing, however, that there are win-win solutions to this thing, and yet so many people just don't want to go there. And they'll do it only after we got over the cliff, and then we're going to say, oh, how do we come back up the cliff?
I agree. So optimistic about our long-term future, if only we let ourselves get there.
Exactly.
That's a somewhat optimistic note to end on. But thank you.
I'll take it.
Yeah, exactly. I'll take it. And hopefully we'll learn over time. What's the best way of people following you, learning more about your work, buying your new book when it comes out? I can include links in the show notes, of course. So.
Thank you. There's one place basically to go, and that's figsinwinter.blog. Despite the name is not just a blog, it's really a repository of pretty much everything that I do, including links to books and podcasts and stuff like that. And the name Figs in Winter comes from a phrase by the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who said that if we wish for figs in winter, we're fools, because obviously figs don't produce fruits in winter. That means we should enjoy the figs when they're actually in season, when they're in the summer. So pay attention to what's going on right here, right now, and enjoy what you have, because it's going to be gone.
Wise words. Yeah. Reality matters.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. I'll let you get on with the rest of your day. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you, Massimo.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.